Of my talk today is why Juneteenth is important to the advancement of economic equity and justice in America. The title presupposes there is a connection between Juneteenth and the economic circumstances that black people find themselves in today. It is that thread that I want to pull through this talk with you today as a member of our board. Now, one way to think about this theme is found from a comment I once heard. The speaker said, "We are the products of our history that our ancestors chose, if you are white. If you are black, you might say we are the products of our history that most likely our ancestors did not choose." But here we are as products of those choices, and we have to understand them if we intend to be free from them. Now, I want to explore these choices by asking you a few questions in relation to our theme today. So one question is, what is H.R. 40? Another is, what is General Order Number 3? What is a key debilitating provision in the 13th Amendment? What is the relative black-white net wealth ratio? I know it's sounding kind of heady here, but what is the National Housing Act of 1934? So now let me come back and go to H.R. 40. It is a bill in the U.S. House of Representatives aimed at addressing the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13th American colonies between 1619 and 1865. The bill proposes that Congress establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and a proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, and to make recommendations to Congress about appropriate remedies. Now, understand there were approximately 4 million Americans and their descendants enslaved in the United States and the colonies that became the United States between 1619 and 1865. We also know that the institution was constitutionally and statutorily sanctioned by the government from 1789 through 1865. Further, we know that not only was slavery immoral and inhumane, it also denied those who were enslaved the fruits of their own labor. So as such, H.R. 40 intends to study the ongoing effects of the institution of slavery and its legacy of persistent, systemic structures of discrimination on living African Americans in the United States. So what many of us know is that as a result of our historic and continued discrimination, African Americans continue to suffer debilitating economic, educational, and health hardships, including, but not limited to, having nearly 1 million black people incarcerated today, having an unemployment rate more than twice the current white unemployment rate, and having an average of less than 1/16 of the wealth of white families. And this is a disparity which is worsening year over year. Now, what is important is the fact that federal and state laws, including redlining, educational funding discrepancies, and predatory financial practices, contributed to the discrimination against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who were deemed to be U.S. citizens from 1868 to the present. Now, make no mistake about it, there are laws and policies which continue to disproportionately and negatively affect African Americans as a group. So even though the Emancipation Proclamation was made effective in 1863, enslaved people in the state of Texas were not free until June 19th of 1865, which we are talking about as Juneteenth. Many of us know that a general named Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, and proclaimed that enslaved people were, at that time, free. Now let me share an excerpt from that proclamation, which was called General Order Number 3. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer," end quote. But as we know, it didn't turn out that way. From 1865 to 1877, Reconstruction, which should have been called Deconstruction, was marked by tremendous hope as millions of formerly enslaved people attempted to reunify their families, promote educational institutions, run for political office, and even pushed for legislation seeking compensation from former slaveholders. But the positive potential was compromised by the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, most people understand that it abolished slavery. However, upon closer examination, the language in the amendment created a different form of bondage. The amendment says, and this is a quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." End quote. The key wording here is, open quote, "except as punishment for crime," end quote, because that was the government's way to provide for another form of bondage. So irrespective of what General Gordon Granger proclaimed on June 19th of 1865 about the new employer-employee relationship, that did not apply to free black people who were unfairly accused and convicted of crimes. What happened then leads to much of what is happening now with inequities within the criminal justice system. Now, another question is, what is net worth? I'm going to shift and talk about that a bit. It is the total assets one has minus total debt. Now, I know this is not a kind of an economic lecture, but I think it's important to understand this. This includes savings from income, home equity, 401k investments, stocks, bonds, etc. Generally, when we think of wealth in this context, we're thinking of net worth, the total amount of your net assets. There is a 13-to-1 ratio differential between the median net worth of white households, which is around $141,900, and of black households, which is $11,000 in the United States. It is an understatement to say that income contributes to generating wealth, and the larger issue is that the more income one has, more opportunities one has to not only save money, but to purchase assets, to pay off debts, all of which leads to increases in net wealth. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a look at home ownership, which is an aspect of this net wealth. Research has shown that if we could equalize the black and white rates of home ownership, and if we could equalize the equity, which, as we know, is dependent upon property values, we could in fact reduce the black-white wealth divide by almost 50%. That, of course, means we would have to address many of the negative legacy issues, like redlining, that have persisted since the 19th century. Perhaps what is most disturbing is that many of these inequities, they were really sustained by the governmental interventions. Let's look at property ownership from another perspective. Although President Andrew Johnson originally promised 40 acres of land to each former slave who fought in the Civil War on behalf of the Union, he reversed that in the summer of 1865 by ordering all land under federal control to be returned to its previous white slave owners. Imagine, this left the black people without land. When Johnson rescinded the offer to those who fought for their country, he literally locked formerly enslaved people into sharecropping, where they were physically free, but financially imprisoned by the system. Imagine what that 13-to-1 relative wealth ratio might look like today if blacks had been allowed to create generational wealth. Another way that generational wealth was thwarted after 1865 was whites could arbitrarily accuse a black person of a crime of indebtedness, and then could take their land, and blacks could not fight in court because they were legally prohibited from bringing whites into court. Now, as I was thinking about this talk, in a research article from 2006, 406 black landowners were victims of land seizure and lost an amount estimated in the tens of millions of dollars in today's economy. Today, that land and the wealth it generates belongs to corporations or white communities, and some portion now forms a country club in Virginia. Think of what that could have meant in terms of college education and passing on generational wealth. Now, I'm going to dig a bit deeper into this home mortgage area because I want to make sure that I'm driving home a point. As you think about mortgages and that they're a source of generational wealth, think about this. From the 1930s through the 1960s, black people across the country were largely cut out of the legitimate home mortgage market. This was effectively done when the government established the National Housing Act in 1934. The Federal Housing Administration administered the law and created what was now known as redlining, which effectively was state-sponsored segregation. The government refused to issue mortgages in or near black neighborhoods while subsidizing the builders who were mass-producing entire subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of the homes could be sold to blacks. Between 1934 and 62, the federal government insured $120 billion in home loans. More than 98% of the loans were made to whites, only 2% to African Americans. Now I want to go to another place, and I'm going to talk about the GI Bill, formerly known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, provided military veterans returning from World War II with many benefits, including low-cost mortgages, high school or vocational education, college tuition, and living expenses, unemployment insurance, low-interest loans for veterans to start businesses. Although the GI Bill was considered a success, African American veterans were denied many of its benefits. These losses have contributed to many of the ongoing challenges in the African American community, including earning enough to support a family, putting food on the table, and saving for a future. But unlike other policies or legislation, the GI Bill did not specifically exclude African American veterans. However, African American veterans were subjected to the same discriminatory policies and legislation flowing from the National Housing Act. For example, they were excluded from low-cost government-backed loans, and they were effectively excluded from the suburbs by a combination of deed covenants and informal racism. White veterans, on the other hand, were able to purchase government-guaranteed mortgages in the country's fastest-growing suburbs, and in so doing experienced significant equity gains in the value of their homes over the past few decades. As I noted before, this created household wealth, which laid the foundation for the American middle class. Now, I'm going to take you to a step further and look at the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration, or the VA, whose purpose is to represent and serve the interests of military veterans, did not do so in the case of African American veterans. Instead, the agency participated in discrimination. For example, the VA helped prevent black veterans from obtaining unemployment benefits. Black veterans were offered substantially lower wages than white counterparts for the same work. But when these veterans took complaints about job and wage discrimination to the VA would terminate the unemployment insurance of those who were appealing to it rather than investigating the discrimination. This made it nearly impossible for black veterans to refuse work for unfair wages. Now here's interesting. At the same time, the VA attorneys testified on behalf of many white military veterans to help them regain the same job at the same pay as they had before going off to war. So now as we think about this, I feel compelled to have to talk about one more issue, and that's voter suppression. I guess I would be remiss if I did not mention another form of government discrimination in the form of what is currently happening in many states throughout this country, and that is voter suppression. Now, I must admit that I take issue with calling it voter suppression because it truly is voter nullification, where primarily white legislators are passing laws which are attempting to effectively eliminate the votes of black and brown people. Now, all of what I have mentioned has created generational traumas, which begs the obvious question: how do you heal historical racial trauma? First and foremost, there's a need for acknowledgement. But that requires that truths need to be told about our history. We have to tell the story. That in turn needs to be followed by an apology, which, when combined with acknowledgement, can move us along the road to reconciliation. Now, reconciliation would also require us to deal with the structural and systemic issues that perpetuate discrimination. But even here, state legislators, including here in Kentucky, are proposing bans on any kind of training or education on racial issues that might make people uncomfortable. So returning to my earlier question regarding H.R. 40, I'd like you to know this. Before his death in 2019, Representative John Conyers and Sheila Jackson Lee introduced this bill, H.R. 40, to every Congress since 1989, asking for the creation of the commission to study the long-term impacts of slavery and the possibilities of reparations. What I have shared throughout this talk is that the federal and state governments have been actively and aggressively involved in discriminatory legislation that directly tied to the socioeconomic disparities between whites and blacks in this country. These differences are not inconsequential, and some can argue that they are worsening. Another question that I have is, how can a government which has been so blatant in its discriminatory practices in the past now ignore the need to, at a minimum, support the creation of a commission to study the effects of black folks and to come up with some recommendations on how to approach reconciliation in order to promote racial healing? Each passing day without the work of the commission only exacerbates the pain of loss.
My name is Silas Birch, and I became a member in 1953. And our pastor, Dr. Miller, for our fall revival, he had everyone that was a Christian stand and move to one side, and everyone who was not to move over to the other side. And he asked those of us